This module we're going to go over db.currentOp again. I say again because it was covered to some extent in M102. We're going to look at it in a little bit more detail. We're going to give you a couple of examples of how to sort of parse the output in a meaningful way. Some caveats about how to actually use that output, how to not do the wrong thing, as it were. The first thing to understand about db.currentOp is it is very useful. So when you're trying to figure out what's going on in a particular system, it is certainly a nice tool to have. However, it does have limitations. And those limitations can be pretty significant. So let's list some of those out. So the first limitation of currentOp is that it is point in time. Right, so when you run it and when you execute it, the view it gives you is just for that particular sort of millisecond, right? The time it takes to actually examine all of the operations running. So you can run it multiple times, trying to catch the particular thing that you're trying to find, but then you can run into this final one that I've listed here, potentially huge output. You can have thousands of operations running concurrently on a particular MongoDB instance. So combine those two things and it can be very difficult to actually find that needle in the haystack that you're actually looking for. So it can be a little bit frustrating that way. It'll always list long-running operations, right? So this is the classic case. This is not a bad thing necessarily, but it can be a limitation for a particular tool in that it leads to misdiagnosis. In the same way that db.server status showing up in logs can lead to a misdiagnosis for that being the cause. Similarly, long-running ops are always going to show up in your output, so the fact that you see them so often, the fact that they seem to be running for a long time, can lead to sort of a misdiagnosis that this must be my issue. I have a slow database and these operations are always showing up, so that must be what's causing things to be slow. That may not necessarily be the case. So that can be a little bit of a limitation or lead to red herrings when you're looking at currentOp output. May not list namespaces for non-active operations. So there is a sort of a race condition if the namespace, and by namespace I mean the database .collection. So a fully formed namespace would be db.collection. So test.foo, for example, if you're in the test database and the foo collection, it would be test.foo. So that may not be listed for non-active operations because it's the MongoDB instance at that particular moment in time, particular point in time that you run the command may not have evaluated what namespace an operation is actually for. So you may sort of have these anonymous operations floating around in your currentOp output, particularly on busy systems. So you combine all these things together, it can mean that using currentOp for diagnosis can be a challenge, to say the least. But there are a few ways to sort of narrow the playing field. And the first ones that I'm just going to show you are actually listed in our documentation. So let's go to the documentation for currentOp. So here we go. On the currentOp page, explaining the command, we have a few examples of how you might go about reducing that output a little bit. So db.currentOp, that's running the command. Now the output is in the form whereby it gives you this in-prog array. So in-progress operations are returned as an array called in-prog. And this little snippet of code, what it's doing is it's iterating over each element in that array. So that's what the for each loop is, and running a quick function. So the function is very, very simple. It basically says if something is waiting for a lock, d.waitingforlock exists, and d.lockType is not equal to read, then print out that operation. So in other words, anything that doesn't have a lock type of read, print it out. Essentially, anything you find in the in-prog array does not have a lock type of read and is waiting for a lock, print that out. So those would be write operations that are waiting for a write lock. So there was probably something else blocking them. If you were to take that same output and you want to know, okay, well, I've got a list of operations. This returns several operations that are actually waiting for a write lock. Well, how do you figure out what they're waiting for? Well, you've got the exact same output, of course, assuming that write is still active. You could rerun this command. Again, it's a for each loop, loops through, looks for an active operation. So in other words, in the document, is there an active field? Does it exist? And then if the lock type is write, print it out. There should only be one of those per database. So there you go. You could combine those two pieces of information to find out, first of all, how many write operations, that was our first example, are waiting on the lock, and then what's actually holding the lock would be this second command. So you can see just some simple JavaScript to actually loop through those things. You can run these directly from the shell. This would be return all active read operations. So very, very similar to the first one that we did, except you have the equivalency operator for read, and you're looking for anything that's actually active. There could be hundreds and hundreds of those, depending on how many concurrent reads you're actually doing. So a few quick examples there with code, which you can find in our documentation and run yourself very easily. So informational use, cdocs for the common examples. There is one thing that you can pass into DB currentOp, and I'll just draw it in here as the optional argument. You can pass in a boolean, true. And what the true argument will do when passed into currentOp is give you more verbose output. It will list things like the operations related to connections to the MongoDB, for example. Sort of the internal system type of operations. So idle connections, system operations are normally excluded from the output. So that goes back to here, potentially huge output. You're making it even bigger. You imagine how large a system with 10,000 connections in the connection pool might look if you pass in the true argument to currentOp. So for informational use and parsing through some of those fields, we've got a few examples in the documentation.